Great. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Mark Winfield, and I'm professor here at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I'm happy to welcome you to the next in our Sustainable Energy Initiative webinar series. This is a series that we run each year on current topics around climate change, energy, and energy systems transitions. Um, Before I introduce our speakers, as we always do with formal events at York University, we begin with a land acknowledgement, but as we're in a virtual mode, I invite you to reflect on the history of the territories where you may be located and their histories of occupation and colonization as that has evolved. In the case of the university, we recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories on which the university's campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. The area known as Takaranto has been the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabeg, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. In particular, I want to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and also note that the territory on which I'm located is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And with today's topic, which is around questions of critical minerals and circularity in electric vehicle battery supply chains, questions around the impacts on mining activities in particular on Indigenous communities are central to these conversations. As we know here in Ontario, there are debates around the Ring of Fire in northeastern Ontario and around the Grassy Narrows area in northwestern Ontario in particular. I'm very happy to welcome today Laura Lasciuto and Sudeshna Mohanty with the Rocky Mountain Institute. Laura is manager of RMA's carbon-free transportation team, and she leads the Battery Circular Economy Initiative, which aims to advance a circular, resilient, and responsible EV battery supply chain that can help meeting growing demands for electric vehicles while respecting human rights and the environment. And our second speaker is Sudeshna Mohanty, who is a senior associate with the Rocky Mountain Institute's carbon-free transportation team, working on catalyzing a just and equitable transitions to EVs. This session has some interesting origins in the sense that this question around electric vehicle supply chains has been evolving for some time, and I think a number of people have both been thinking about both the front end in terms of supply chain questions and also the back end in terms of what happens at end of life for EV batteries and what potential there was for circularity. And I think we sort of discovered a number of different research groups who are working on these questions simultaneously, but quite independently. I was working through SEI with a couple of students at Osgood, our law school, Jonathan Myers and Sumit Such, looking at the regulatory frameworks around, I don't know if this is going to work or not, around end-of-life electric vehicle batteries in North America and Europe. And part of our finding was that regulatory frameworks around that question were essentially non-existent. We knew that there was we found another group working at the Public Policy Forum who were working on the same questions. And we also began to pick up on the work happening at the Rocky Mountain Institute on the same questions. And that led ultimately to a panel at the Energy Modeling Hub in December of this year that Sudeshna participated in, focused on questions of critical minerals. We also had there someone from the Federal Environmental Commissioner's Office who had just done an audit on the Government of Canada's critical minerals strategy and highlighted that there had not been very much attention paid to wider sustainability concerns there. And we had Jamie Neen from Mining Watch Canada as well. And Sudeshna did a presentation there on the work that was happening at RMI. And this was very interesting on multiple levels, that it was specifically around the critical minerals and circularity questions. But it also struck me within the energy modeling context that this was one of the first serious attempts to start to deconstruct what might happen on the supply side of these questions. We tend to see fairly straightforward sort of upwards projections in terms of demand for energy, and with that, materials. We've seen things from the IEA suggesting 30-time increase in demand for certain materials as a result of movement in direction of electrification. This is one of the first times we'd seen an attempt to sort of break down what that might mean, and whether or not there are different pathways that we might take that might reduce the impacts and risks of those sorts of directions. And we kind of realized at EMH that we only had 10 minutes for Sudeshna's presentation, which was not enough. And clearly there was a whole lot more here. And so that led us to the invitation for Laura and Sudeshna to join us today and have sort of a fuller space of time to talk about the work that has been happening at Rocky Mountain Institute, and to help us think about what the implications going forward are in terms of the material dimensions of energy system transitions. Consistent with our usual practices, we're going to have the presentation first, so ask people to hold questions, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. We'll use, because we're in Zoom meeting mode, we can ask people to use the raise hand function. You can also put questions into the chat, although experience tells us managing that sometimes challenging. Sometimes these meetings generate a lot of traffic, which is a good thing. But I have asked one of our Master Environmental Studies Juris Doctor students, JJ Strantz, to monitor the chat for us and to pull out any consistent themes that are emerging from those conversations. I'm going to emphasize that our subject matter today has kind of taken on a geopolitical significance that we didn't anticipate when we were organizing the session. So I'm going to ask, we'll kind of leave some of those larger questions for another day, but focus questions when we get there very much on the content of what we're hearing today in terms of the work that's been done on how these supply chains might evolve. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Laura first, and then Sudeshna. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thanks everyone for joining, and thanks again to Mark and to York University for hosting us. I'm Laura Lasciuto. I'm a manager at RMI, formerly known as the Rocky Mountain Institute, and I'm here today with my colleague Sudeshna Mohanty. We are part of the carbon-free transportation team at RMI, and our work is focused on EV batteries, including the minerals that go into them, the supply chain that builds them, the use and end-of-life management of the batteries. So before we get into our content today, I want to start by just saying a few words about who RMI is and what we do. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank, and our mission is to transform the global energy system to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. We do that by identifying system-level interventions and scaling market-based solutions in 4 key sectors, which are electricity, buildings, transportation, and heavy industry. We were founded 40 years ago by Amory Lovins. We're headquartered in Colorado in the US, but we have 700 staff across the US and around the world. So as I mentioned, Sud and I are part of our transportation team, which in 2022 launched a new initiative focused on EV battery circularity. We launched the Battery Circular Economy Initiative, or BCEI, to help advance a resilient and responsible EV battery supply chain that can ensure that the supply chain does not become the limiting factor in the EV transition, either due to physical supply chain constraints or negative perceptions, and also ensure that the materials are sourced responsibly and used efficiently. So today we want to share with you some insights from our team and other teams at RMI about how we can re-envision the battery supply chain to rethink critical mineral demand. As I said, Sud and I primarily work on issues related to EV batteries, but today we'll be talking a little more broadly about the lithium-ion battery supply chain. So first, let's start with some context. In 2023, global battery demand was 1 terawatt hour. And by 2030, we expect that to grow to 5.5 to 8 times what it was. So you can see on this slide 2 scenarios, the current fast pace of growth on the left and an accelerated case on the right. We use these 2 scenarios of fast and faster in much of our modeling because growth has often surpassed expectations, and there's just not really a slow uptake option when it comes to battery demand. So in either scenario, we expect global annual battery demand in 2050 to be at least 12 times what it is today. As you can see, the vast majority of that demand is driven by cars and trucks, but stationary storage also plays a role here. This increasing demand for batteries means that the demand for battery minerals, such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and copper, is set to increase dramatically. In this chart, in each bar, the darker color indicates the increase in demand to make new batteries, and the lighter color in the bar refers to the increased demand from other uses of those minerals. So you can see how much battery demand is driving the mineral demand here. And for lithium, cobalt, and nickel specifically, the first 3 columns on the chart, the increase is mostly driven by batteries. Now, in a business as usual scenario, the increased demand would be met through mining. I'm not going to spend time today discussing the specific impacts of mining because I think you're probably all familiar with those, at least at a high level. And I think for our purposes today, it suffices to say that meeting all of this demand with newly mined minerals would carry significant environmental and social risk. As such, we want to use our time today to talk about 3 things. First, how can we bend the curves of supply and demand to reach net zero mineral extraction for lithium-ion batteries? Second, what do the costs and returns of battery recycling look like if you factor in externalities? And then finally, although we're going to spend most of our time today talking about quantitative analysis that we've done on these first 2 points, we do want to end by spending a few minutes talking about what actions stakeholders can take to drive change. We've got about 30 minutes of content to share with you, and then we'll hold another 30 minutes or so for questions. Last year, RMI published a report called the Battery Mineral Loop, which outlined 6 solutions to manage rapid mineral demand increase, and also quantified the impacts that those solutions have already had and are expected to have on mineral demand. On this slide, you can see the 6 solutions listed in decreasing order of impact on demand so far. First here is different chemistries, which means deploying different battery chemistries that require fewer critical minerals. The second solution is higher energy density batteries, which means storing more energy per kilogram through better battery engineering. The third is recycling, which means recycling batteries at the end of their life to reuse their materials in new battery production. The next solution is reuse and extended lifetimes, which means using batteries for longer in their primary applications and also reusing them in new secondary applications to avoid frequent replacements and get more service from a smaller stock of batteries and their minerals. The fifth is efficient vehicles, which means making cars lighter weight and more aerodynamic, and also right-sizing them for purpose to allow for smaller batteries for the same vehicle range. And finally, we have efficient mobility, which involves reducing the demand for motorized transportation altogether by inducing mode shift to public transit, electric micromobility, cycling, and walking. This is perhaps the hardest of the 6 solutions, but a really important one that's sometimes left out of the conversation. Now, 3 of the solutions that I just mentioned, chemistry change, density improvements, and recycling, have already had meaningful impact on reducing demand for lithium, nickel, and cobalt. And I just want to mention that the reason we focus on these three minerals in this report is because, as we saw in the earlier slide, these are the three minerals for which batteries are the biggest contributor to growth. On this slide, you can see the impacts of these three solutions to date on lithium, nickel, and cobalt. The dark blue all the way on the left is what demand would have been without these solutions. And then in the multicolored bar, you can see in aqua the reduction in mineral demand from chemistry change since 2015. Yellow is the reduction in mineral demand due to density improvements. And green is the reduction from recycling. There's also a small gray bar there for second life. So altogether, you can see that if we had continued to make batteries just as we did in 2015, and we didn't reuse or recycle any of them, lithium demand in 2023 would have... I'm sorry? Oh, I think maybe someone was off mute. So if we had continued to make batteries just as we did in 2015, and we didn't reuse or recycle any of them, lithium demand in 2023 would have been about 58% higher than it actually was. And nickel and cobalt would have been more than twice as high as they actually were. So you can see these solutions have already had a major impact. And now I want to talk a little bit more about each of these three solutions to understand what they involve and how they can help us bend the curve of mineral demand moving forward. So let's start with chemistry change. Most EV batteries today are lithium-based chemistries. And as we saw before, EVs are responsible for the majority of battery demand. Historically, the majority of these batteries have also required significant amounts of nickel and cobalt, but recently there's been a shift to move to chemistries that require little to no nickel or cobalt, such as lithium iron phosphate or LFP batteries. And if we look to the future, the outlook projected by Bloomberg New Energy Finance indicates a growing adoption of alternatives such as sodium-ion batteries, which avoid lithium altogether. Now, if we model the potential impact of these expected chemistry changes, we can see that mineral demand decreases significantly. And for nickel and cobalt, the demand nearly halves in 2050. Moving on to the impact of the second solution, this is improving energy density. The first thing I want to say here is that there's a learning curve associated with new technologies. So since 2011, energy density has improved by roughly 6% for every doubling of cumulative battery demand. As we make more batteries, we get better at it and we make them denser. And that's how energy density has continued to improve so much. Now, we do estimate that about a third of that improvement is actually connected to chemistry change because some battery chemistries are more dense than others. So we actually removed that here to avoid double counting here and look at just the amount of change due to energy density. And the net result is that energy density has improved by about 4% per cumulative doubling of battery demand, which means that we've seen improvements of about 25% in just the past decade, which has helped to further limit the need for mined minerals. So you can see that increasing energy density is another solution that has already helped reduce demand for newly mined minerals and can continue to do so in the future. And the third lever I want to talk about is recycling. Researchers from Argonne National Lab and Circular Energy Storage have found that more than half of all lithium-ion batteries are collected for recycling globally. At the same time, today's recovery rate or the efficiency of the recycling process is about 80% for lithium and 95% for nickel and cobalt. So when you combine those collection and recovery rates, you can see that after 2035, when you combine those rates, you can see that after 2035, mineral demand can start trending downwards, which in other words means that we can meet a significant portion of our mineral demand through recycled sources. The impact is significant after 2035 because the recycled feedstocks start to grow as more EV batteries start to retire. So the key point here is that the pace of change we've seen so far for just these three solutions, battery chemistry change, higher energy density, and recycling, indicates that we have the ability to reach peak mining demand for lithium and nickel around year 2035. And for cobalt, we might actually hit that peak before the end of this decade. Now, so far, we've been talking about average improvements for just 3 of the 6 levers that I mentioned earlier. But I want to talk now about a best case scenario. If we accelerate all 6 levers, which involves speeding up chemistry change, looking at top-tier energy density improvements, raising collection rates, further extending battery lifetimes, using more efficient vehicles, and also more efficient mobility options, what happens then in a best case scenario? Well, what happens is that peak mining demand moves down and it moves forward. So in other words, we reduce the high point of annual demand of critical minerals and we hit that high point sooner. And then we start to actually reduce demand for newly mined minerals. So after peaking, battery mineral demand continues to decline. And then as annual battery demand reaches its maximum, losses in the collection and recycling recovery system can be offset by reduced mineral demand per battery due to efficiency and innovation. Because there will always be a little bit of loss in collection and recycling. But if we continue to use the other levers to improve battery efficiency, we can actually offset those losses. For example, if we collect 95% of batteries for recycling and we recover nickel at a 99% efficiency rate under the accelerated case I mentioned, then we achieve a net recovery rate above 94%. So that means that over the course of the battery's lifetime, which can be more than a decade, we would need solutions to curb that demand by just 6% to offset those recycling losses. And to put that in context, over the past decade, vehicle unit nickel demand has dropped by almost 45%. So 6% over a decade certainly seems achievable. Now, putting all this together, what this means is that there is a future where net zero mining demand for lithium, nickel, and cobalt is possible before 2050. Other groups have been coming to the same conclusion lately and seeing this possibility of net zero mining by 2050. For example, the Climate and Community Project at UC Davis helped to inform our work. And we saw new reports from ICCT and the Union of Concerned Scientists on this topic just within the past few months. Now, before I hand it over to Sud, I want to make one more point about why this matters. We often see the statement, critical minerals are the new oil. I don't know if you've heard that. We hear it a lot. It essentially means critical minerals will power our future and drive our global economy the way that oil has done in the past. And while there's an element of that that's true, I want to resoundingly disagree with the overall statement that critical minerals are the new oil, because it's missing a really key point, which is that minerals only need extracting once, and oil needs continuous extraction. We have a set amount of minerals needed to meet demand for all road transport and stationary storage in the future. And if we implement and accelerate all 6 solutions I discussed today, that means that we can reach a point where we no longer need to extract critical minerals for transportation and energy storage. And that's just not the case with oil. That being said, we have a really long way to go to reach the levels of change needed to make this happen. And it will take concerted effort across the value chain. We also need stakeholders to really understand the value of a battery mineral loop. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Sud now to take us through some analysis we did to quantify the benefits of battery recycling specifically. And then she'll close us out by talking more broadly about stakeholder action needed to enact some of the changes that we've talked about here today.
Thank you so much, Laura, for showing us what the future could look like. We just saw that recycling can play a big role in achieving this vision of a net zero mining future. And to build informed policy and investment roadmaps for recycling. We need data-driven insights and shared understanding of the challenges and solutions amongst all stakeholders in the value chain. But today's supply chain is opaque, fragmented, and involves multiple stakeholders with differing interests. As a result, the costs and revenue occur at different parts of the supply chain and hinders coordinated action. We need a system-level assessment that captures all the costs and returns along the system, and that will allow us to get to a targeted viewpoint on where interventions are needed. An iceberg is a very useful metaphor in this situation. Right now, with the standard financial return on investment analysis of recycling, we only see the tip of the iceberg. And we need to quantify the social and environmental impact of battery recycling and battery mineral sourcing to arrive at a true assessment of recycling returns. Now, this can be possible by embracing a triple bottom line approach, an approach that values people and planet alongside profits and is being increasingly adopted by companies across the globe. To develop a triple bottom line framework for recycling, we defined 6 impact metrics across 3 dimensions. The financial metrics include profit pools from battery recycling. The social metrics are the wages earned and the economic impact of these jobs created. The environmental metrics include reductions in carbon emissions, water use, and land use, all converted into dollar values. For analyzing financial profitability, we used Argonne National Labs' EverBAT model to evaluate a wide range of scenarios for costs and revenue. The recycling revenue is going to depend on the residual value of metals in a battery, and that will be determined by the metal market prices and the battery chemistry composition. The cost depends on economies of scale, utilization of infrastructure, and the upstream design of the battery. When you put these wide range of costs and revenue together, the conclusion is that the investment case for recycling can be mixed. It may be profitable, it may not be in certain scenarios. But the outlook shifts if we factor the social and environmental return. This chart over here shows the cumulative value of benefits if all the batteries that are expected to retire in the United States through 2040 are recycled. And one can see that even at the low end of metal prices, where recycling may not be profitable, the triple bottom line return is overwhelmingly positive. And we need to ensure that investment and policy decisions help us to capture this value. To bring this framework to life and understand the uncertainties, we analyzed a set of case studies focused on lithium extraction and recycling. We selected lithium as the focus of the case study because it's a common metal for EV battery chemistries at present and in the foreseeable future. We consider the most polluting and resource-intensive process, hard rock ore mining for lithium, as our baseline. We compared this to direct lithium extraction from brines with geothermal energy. This allows us to assess the impact of technological innovations that can reduce land use and carbon emissions. And finally, we compare all of this to recycling to assess the impact of circular approaches. For an accurate comparison, all these case studies are based out of the United States. To no one's surprise, sourcing lithium from the ground has a net negative impact on the society and environment. The total cost of externalities from mining can be somewhere along $170 to $700 per ton of lithium carbonate production or more. But the economics of recycling LFP, a nascent technology, is challenging. The chart on the left shows the profitability of the three processes under a high and a low metal price scenario. You can see in both scenarios, mining an incumbent technology is a lot more profitable. And recycling, even when profitable in a high metal market price environment, will have a hard time competing with mining, or in terms of attracting investments, since investors will get higher returns from mining. So new technologies need support during their initial phases and get to economies of scale, which helps with cost reductions and efficiency gains. Interventions such as providing incentives for recycled materials can de-risk these recycling investments. As an example, we consider allocating a portion of Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA's 30D incentives available in the United States to be directed to recyclers. The incentives are nominally targeted at consumers, but indirectly target recycling because recycled material qualifies as domestic content, one of the criteria to avail the incentives. So these incentives can be up to $7,000 per EV, and a typical car battery weighs half a ton. This implies, on a per ton basis, the IRA credits can reach up to $14,000. And if only $2,400 of those incentives were allocated to the recycler, the profit margin turns positive and de-risk recycling investments in a volatile market. Other incentives, incentives are not the only way to de-risk recycling investments. Any intervention that can support the offtake of recycled products, anything that builds a clear demand for recycled products and for responsibly made batteries, can help. This can look like levers such as extended producer responsibility and recycled content mandates are policy instruments that can help. On the market side, voluntary measures such as a buyer's alliance to procure recycled minerals can also support recycling. Thus, by clearly evaluating various possible scenarios, quantifying costs and benefits, and improving our understanding of the risks, we can identify targeted interventions to support a circular battery economy. So far, we have shared our key analysis insights from 2024. I want to close out by sharing a few tools and resources from RMI that can help stakeholders to further dive into this data and understand how it translates to action. With the ever-changing EV battery supply chain landscape, we directed our efforts at building interactive tools, web-based dashboards that allows users to build their own scenarios and generate their own insights. The information that Laura shared about net zero mining analysis is now available on our BCI dashboard, helping stakeholders understand how certain parameters impact the global demand for battery minerals. For example, in this snapshot, you can see on the left the types of inputs users can change, including battery demand, innovation, efficiency, and recycling. And on the right, you can see one of the outputs generated, in this case, the net demand for lithium through the years, as well as cumulative demand through 2050, reduction in demand, and peak demand year. With this data, we hope to inform efficient and effective investments in mining and recycling. The Minerals Loop dashboard exists alongside our US supply chain dashboard. We focused on various aspects of building a domestic circular economy in the United States. This was one of the first dashboards we built, published about a year ago. It focuses on identifying supply chain gaps and the opportunity for recycling to play a role as a function of the battery demand in the United States. We translate the battery demand into the demand for raw materials and key components. We aggregate data on existing and announced company investments to get a picture of the remaining supply chain gaps and vulnerabilities. We also convert the battery demand into end-of-life projections, and that allows us to understand the opportunity for recycling to meet demand, the financial value of reduced reliance on imports, as well as the associated emission reductions. Now, common to all our dashboards is a user input panel. You can choose demand levels, battery life, as well as other inputs for recycling. And on the right on this slide, you see the projected supply chain gaps in 2030. One of the 7 outputs you can view on our dashboard. This is information is in the process of getting updated with new investment announcements through 2024. And we are also working to incorporate the medium and heavy duty battery demand in here. Right now, the demand we have considered comes from the private passenger car segment within light duty vehicles. Now, beyond these 2 dashboards, which are available, are live, the battery triple bottom line analysis of battery recycling that I just shared will be available as a live dashboard in the coming weeks. And beyond the tools to help with data-led decision-making, we also share our insights through thought leadership articles. Last month, we published a report in collaboration with the World Economic Forum and the Global Battery Alliance, which highlights 5 key concerns about today's battery value chain and the 5 solutions we need to address these concerns. The report identifies who needs to be involved and explains in detail what steps they can take. To build a robust circular supply chain and lessen our demand for mined minerals, we will need technological interventions and policy changes, as well as workforce transition planning. The technological solutions will include building traceability platforms, adopting design for circularity principles, and developing data standards for reuse and effective end-of-life management. Policy changes are needed to address the techno-economic challenges and for ensuring responsible cross-border movement of batteries to regions that rely on second-hand EVs or batteries. And as with everything else, this transition to a circular economy won't be possible without transitioning the workforce. Governments, industry representatives, and educational institutions will need to work together to ensure that workers have the skills they need to succeed in a circular economy. So this brings me to, this is all we had to share with you today. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you both. I mean, there's just an enormous amount of material in there. And I'm sure that I've seen a little bit of traffic in the chat, but we'd like to move into the Q&A. And I'm going to ask people either please use the raise hand function in Zoom if you want to ask your question directly, and I'll ask people to be concise in their questions, please. We don't need statements or supplemental analysis at this stage. Or failing that, we can also put things into the chat, and JJ's watching that to see if we've seen some traffic there already. So either way, I'm quite happy to open the floor to questions. I've got a couple myself, but I'm going to see if anybody wants to put their hand up first. Okay, well, that's surprising, but I will go with a couple of questions. I had one that I was wondering about, and I remember this from the Energy Modeling Hub presentation, was your estimates on the recovery rate in recycling lithium and cobalt and other materials, and I was curious where that came from, because when we were doing the work for our end of life study, we were having real problems finding reasonable numbers in terms of or finding any numbers at all in terms of what level of recovery was realistic to consider. So I was wondering if you give us some insights on where those numbers came from.
Mark, I certainly resonate with that sentiment when we embarked on this analysis. Like there were so many numbers, and the hardest one was to find something for lithium.
Yeah.
So nickel and cobalt was pretty standard. 95% is pretty much the recovery rate at a minimum. And with newer recycling processes, there are claims by different startups or even bigger companies which are more close to commercial production at going at 99% or 99.5%. With lithium, what we observed was that there is this absolute minimum of 80% recovery. There was a systematic study, I believe, done by Transport and Energy looking at recycling in Europe, and they established that 80% is a minimum, but with, again, improvements going forward, more than 90% recovery is certainly possible for lithium. So we have a floor, and the ceiling is still being decided for these recovery rates. And we understand this landscape is constantly changing, and that was one of the reasons when we built our dashboard, we wanted to make it a tool where users can get to their own understanding of this. Right? So if a recycler today comes and wants to use the dashboard and they claim their recovery rate is not 80% for lithium, but rather it's 95%, they know what is the value in getting those minerals in terms of finances, in terms of emissions, and so on.
Excellent. Thank you. See if there's anything on the floor before we go to what's in the chat. One we've had in the chat is around, I think we touched on this, but it may be useful to just talk about it a bit more. Was the question around cost of recycled materials versus newly extracted. And I think we saw something on the margins there that it still looked like primary extraction was still looking cheaper than the recycling, recovering material from recycling. And I just want to revisit that because that question seemed to come up. That seemed to be the case, that this seems to be the problem. That it's still, presumably, particularly for established mines, it's cheaper to extract than to recycle, seemed to be where we were at.
Yeah, that is certainly where the data is pointing us towards. The cost of recycling is more than mining. We don't, since the markets, like metals are commodities, right? So you'll always get a metal market price without understanding whether it came from a mine source or a cycle source. So a proxy for that understanding of what does a mine material cost versus a recycled material cost is look at the profit margins. And if the profit margin for mining is higher, that means mine sources are cheaper. And I would like to share a little bit on what we have done as a landscape research. It is not necessarily presented over here, but there are many levers to drive down these costs. So startups are working on improving the technological efficiency of their recycling processes. So for example, if somebody has planned their investment or their technology in a way that the nickel and cobalt are extracted first before you get to lithium recovery, that would involve more costs when you're processing a LFP battery, which contains no nickel or cobalt, right? So acknowledging that LFP is going to be the predominant chemistry in the future, if you make the process more efficient by putting lithium extraction or recovery at the start of the process, you can bring down cost. You can look at alternative technologies as an alternatives to metallurgical extraction. So there is chromatographic separation. So once you start looking at other technologies, you can bring down cost. One of the key cost components with recycling is related to the transportation of batteries. It's not easy to transport, or it's very costly to transport used EV batteries. And if there are innovations to bring that cost down, or there are more, or you reduce the distance that the batteries have to travel, the used batteries have to travel before they get to an intermediate known as black mass. The typical process is you collect all of those batteries, you bring it to a pre-processing facility, you crush it to black mass, and from the black mass, you can recover the minerals. A lot of the cost is involved in the first step of the process of collecting and transporting it before it can be crushed. So if the black mass generation facilities are present more closely to where the batteries are being generated, then you can bring down those costs as well. So there are opportunities where, like, I can see that as you start going to economies of scale, you can bring down those costs down, bring the cost down for recycling, and the profit margins get better. I'll pause and see if Laura had anything to add here.
No, I think that was a really good answer there, Sue, to why the cost discrepancy exists, and also some of the interventions that are needed to kind of correct for that in the market.
Just a question of clarification from Karen here. The recovery rate that Sue was referring to, is that for the rate at which the batteries are being collected, or is that the rate at which material, once it's into the recycling stream, you know, the total amount that went into the recycling stream was collected, you know, at that stage, does that number reflect what then gets recovered once you've got a battery into the system, as opposed to what that collection rate?
Absolutely. It's the later. The collection rate needs to be an independent factor, and the recovery rate of the recycling process is an independent factor. And when you put both of this together, and there can be another lever in between, like, do you have sufficient capacity to process all the material, collected batteries? So you have collection level, you have a capacity level, and then it is the technological efficiency of the process, which is the recovery rate of the minerals once they have reached the facilities.
That's very interesting. I mean, one of the things we found was we just couldn't find information on the actual recovery, like the recovery rate for the batteries, in terms of where were they actually ending up.
Yeah.
We were very struck by that nobody seemed to be able to give us an answer about what the actual rate at which what we
Batteries
assumed were end of life were actually making it into some kind of a process.
So okay. If you want to look at that data for, say, North America, there are not really a lot of sources that have been tracking like when batteries are getting retired and how much of the retired batteries are getting collected for recycling. But on a global scale, we mentioned this during the slide on collection rates. A researcher based out of Europe has looked at tracking the collection rate of batteries, retired batteries, and that was a paper that I think came out last year. And he established that more than half of the batteries that are getting retired, so that's the collection rate, are getting collected for recycling. The organization's name is Circular Energy Storage. Europe is one of those, the European Union is one of the regions that tracks this data set, and they certainly had something very close to 50% in terms of all batteries that are collected for recycling. And then you can go on to a global level and track, like, eventually how much did we recycle where, or collect for recycling where. So that's what the circular energy storage research points us to.
Yeah, that would make sense in the sense that one of the things we found was the European Union has a directive on end-of-life batteries, which includes battery passports and things like that, which are clearly designed to precisely generate that kind of data in terms of what's actually happening, and actually to provide the sort of chain of custody records as well in terms of where batteries are ending up.
And that's why traceability is
Okay.
such a key measure to understand, like, are we actually managing our end-of-life batteries? Because many regions of the world do not track this right now. And traceability is a great way to do that. Battery passports as a traceability platform are a great way to do that.
Yeah, we were struck by the crickets on the other end of the phone when we started asking questions. This was US EPA, Cal EPA,
Yeah.
ECCC in Canada, Ontario Ministry of the Environment. Nothing, absolutely nothing. It was quite stunning. Another question is from Tatiana asking Laura, going back, I think, to the slides, we might need to go back to the screen share. You were looking at the sort of reduction rates, I think it was, in terms of specific materials, lithium, nickel, sort of relative to what it would have been. And I think just asking for a bit more explanation of what's going on there. We might need to go back into the screen share to look at that slide in the deck.
Yeah, let me see if I can easily do that. I think this is the slide.
Yeah, I think this is the one the questioner may have in mind.
Great. So what this slide is showing here is on the left in these dark blue bars. This is what demand would have been for lithium, nickel, and cobalt in 2023 if we hadn't put into place any of the solutions that I was outlining here. So what we're seeing is then in the multicolored bar, the demand reduction for each of these critical minerals from 4 solutions, mostly from 3 of them, but the solutions here are chemistry change, which is shown in aqua. That aqua bar is the reduction in mineral demand due specifically to chemistry change in batteries. So you can see like nickel and cobalt have significant, I don't know why I'm pointing at my screen, you can't see my screen, but have significant reductions because of the shift to LFP batteries away from NMC batteries. So there's a more significant drop in nickel and cobalt from chemistry change as opposed to the change in lithium. And then in the yellow bars, you see the reduction in each of these critical minerals from energy density improvements. So as batteries became more dense and we stored more energy per kilogram, this is how much lithium, nickel, and cobalt were saved due to that improvement in energy density. And then in the green, you see the reduction in each of these minerals due to recycling. You can also see there's a small gray bar that indicates the reductions from second life, so battery reuse. That's very small because that's a small nascent industry right now. So when you put these things together, what you're seeing here is the reduction in demand for each of these critical minerals that occurred from these 3 solutions. So you see how much less lithium, nickel, and cobalt we used in reality compared to what we would have used if we didn't have these 3 solutions in place. So for lithium, we used 58% less lithium than we would have if we hadn't had these solutions in place. For nickel, we used 127% less, and for cobalt, we used 138% less.
So what we're capturing here, in an energy efficiency context, we'd be talking about natural efficiency gains. That these are absent any policy interventions. These are things that are happening essentially for market reasons as manufacturers are trying to reduce costs of their inputs and gaining efficiencies on their own.
Yeah, I'd largely say that's true. I mean, we didn't separate out any policy impact that did take place here. And these are global numbers. So there is some policy in place in the EU, for example, that might have impacted, say, the reductions in critical mineral demand due to recycling. In the US, there's not really policy in place, so that wouldn't be as much of a factor. So we didn't separate it out by market solution versus policy, but given where we are in the policy space right now, I'd say that is largely what has driven it. Yes.
Yeah, that would make sense. One of the other questions we've had come up here from Karen, what do we know about what happens to the non-metal materials in batteries during the existing recycling process? And as I know the practice seems to be to turn them into black mass, which means grind them up. What do we know about what happens with the waste that comes from those processes? Because presumably the minerals are, the lithium and the cobalt are a fairly tiny portion of the overall battery that's going into that process.
Yeah, that's certainly a deep, that's certainly a great question. What we know is right now we are able to recover or focus our recovery efforts on lithium, nickel, cobalt, aluminum, and copper, so all the metals. There is specific efforts to find a viable way of getting graphite out as well, because graphite is also considered a critical minerals. So largely the recycling efforts have been around the critical minerals, and critical minerals are classified as such because they're the most expensive or the most supply chain resiliency risks. I don't remember seeing much on the extraction of anything else apart from the metals that I mentioned, graphite, right now. I would also point out that there's this other technological innovation that would take care of probably everything, called as direct recycling. There are a few startups in this space. There has been tremendous amount of research happening on this at Argonne National Lab. But what you're trying to do there is you're trying to repair the cathode. The reason why you're retiring batteries is because the electrolyte or the cathode has degraded. And if you can treat that failure mechanism without crushing those batteries, you basically can regenerate the cathode as is. And at that point of time, everything that goes into the cathode, the plastics, the PVDF, the binders, everything is recovered. It hasn't reached commercialization yet.
Because I'm getting the impression, I mean, there's been discussion around design for disassembly and repair, but my impression is we're making zero progress in terms of almost the battery design, as I've understood, is almost going in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
It's making it harder and harder to take them apart so that you could make that kind of repair and effectively retain all the plastic and other components of the battery if you can just fix the cathode or replace the cathode. And we don't seem to be getting anywhere with that, as I understand it.
Yes, but as things are, like, different developments influence each other. So if direct recycling becomes viable, and people see economic gain in designing for disassembly, then both those things can go forward together.
Another question here from Martha, just asking, in your model for recycling, are old batteries assumed to enter the recycling process at zero cost?
No, there's a cost of payables based on the residual value of the minerals. So when you see the triple bottom line accounting analysis come live on the dashboard, you actually have an option to choose what level of payables are associated with procuring those batteries for recycling.
Excellent, thank you. Further questions? JJ, have we got anything further in the chat that we haven't covered off yet?
Hey, Mark, do you mind if I respond to a question in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Please do.
there-
If you've been watching as well, then I'll go to Laura here.
Yeah, I can't help myself. There's so many
Yeah,
interesting.
no, please do. We may miss something too. Yeah.
So I think there was a question from Irma in the chat, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. I'm assuming that's the Irma that is referred to here, about preventing child labor and forced labor that are often present in collection. So I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on that. Not that it's not that this is necessarily our major area of expertise, but I do think it's a really important point to raise, and one that we discuss in the report that Sudeshna mentioned, the report we wrote with the World Economic Forum. That is a concern in developing markets, that there is potential for informal end-of-life industries to develop. And by informal industries, I mean ones in which individuals collect, sort, repurpose, recycle waste without proper training or regulation. Some people say, well, that's not going to happen with lithium-ion batteries because lithium-ion batteries are dangerous to handle, and people won't do that. But that's not necessarily the case. We've seen this happen with lead-acid batteries. We've seen it happen with e-waste. The Indian government says that it's happening today with lithium-ion batteries in India. So I think integrating these informal processes into the formal economy is a real opportunity and necessity here. There's also work to be done on ensuring that that batteries aren't being kind of disposed of in countries that don't have the proper infrastructure and training to deal with them. So there's kind of a role for international trade regulation and international waste management standards here too. There was an amendment to the Basel Convention recently to ensure that all countries receiving e-waste have to sign off on that shipment before it can be sent, meaning they're trying to prevent the sort of dumping of e-waste in countries that don't want it and aren't equipped to handle it. That doesn't apply to EV batteries, but I think that sort of regulation, ensuring that second life batteries, used batteries, can flow across borders and can be shipped. The battery materials can be shipped across borders is important, but also that that's being done responsibly. We don't want to prevent the movement of battery materials across borders because we want batteries to have extended life. There are strong use cases for second life batteries in grid infrastructure in developing countries. But we also need to make sure that the batteries that are being sent across borders have useful remaining life and that they're not damaged or defective. And then in combination with kind of the trade regulation piece of it, as we build up the workforce for a circular economy, we need to make sure that we're preventing the development of these informal waste sectors that we've seen happen with other sectors in the past. So I just wanted to quickly touch on that because I think it is a really important point that was raised here.
Yeah, no, I'm probably missed that one, and indeed that does come up as a fairly central theme in the EU directive, that they're quite emphatic. Part of the reason for the chain of custody, and then is also an emphasis on precisely these kinds of questions around labor and safety in any sort of global movement of the materials as well. So again, the Europeans do seem to be kind of ahead of us on this one. They've at least sort of flagged it as something that needs to be being considered in the life cycle and recovery processes. Laura Tenge, did you have a question for us?
I did. Thank you. I was started writing it in the chat, but it's a little bit cumbersome. I'm not sure if I am misinterpreting this. I just would like some clarification on the concept of bending the curve of supply and demand to reach net zero mineral extraction for batteries by 2050. Is that the idea? Is the net zero comes from not having the need for mineral extraction, or is this, like, I know that there's been some suggestions of like powering a mine with an SMR or something to be net zero. I don't know if I missed that, but I would love some clarification, and I have a follow-up question I can ask in the chat.
Yeah, let me see if I can clarify. So I mean, first of all, I should say that, in the short term, we're going to need more mining than we've ever had before. There's no real way around that in the short term. And that's why we need responsible mining standards, and we need mining to be done in the most sustainable, environmentally and socially sustainable way possible. And in the long run, by implementing these 6 solutions that I was discussing around chemistry change and energy density, mobility change, and all of these, we can actually reach net zero demand for raw material extraction, and essentially create a perpetual loop of minerals, because unlike oil, critical minerals can be reused over and over again. So if we combine all these solutions that allow us to reduce demand, and also recycle the critical minerals that we do have, we can essentially eliminate the need for extracting new raw material by 2050. Now that doesn't mean that we are on track to do this right now. We are not we're not where we need to be to do that. But this report, which is based on an article written by our founder about 6 solutions to curb increasing rapid mineral demand. This is sort of a possible future that we've envisioned with these 6 solutions, and that we've modeled to show how it is possible.
I really appreciate that, because that is what I thought you meant, but I just wanted to make sure, because it kind of flags a concern for me. Is it okay if I ask my second question, or should I toss
Sure,
her in the
Laura,
chat?
because Laura's one of our PhD students, just as background.
Just as
and you're the only one asking actual questions, not through the chat. So I'll grant a little bit of latitude that way for that. And then we've got a couple more that have come up now. But
okay,
no,
this is my last one. So just on the slide where you mentioned, and just as you sort of referenced again, that mineral mining would be a one-off, whereas oil and gas extraction is continuous need. First, I want to make it clear, I'm not like a proponent for oil and gas, but I just wonder how refined this analysis will be when you're thinking about sustainability of mining. For example, in Canada, one of the areas that we have for really rich critical minerals is in Ontario, and Northern Ontario, in the Ring of Fire, where there's a large swath of peatlands that hold carbon. When it's disturbed, emissions become released. So while it is a one-time extractive event, there will be continual consequences of GHG emission release that sort of have like thousands of years of time frame of impacts. Is your like how in depth are you going with this? I know we talked about the battery passports, which I really like, but how in depth is your analysis about like what the requirements of what would that look like in your framing of, and when we think about what sustainable is? And that is the end for me. And thank you so much for indulging me.
thanks, Laura.
Yeah, so that slide that I showed, showing the sort of cost of one-off mineral extraction versus continual oil extraction. I mean, that's an illustrative slide to show more so the cost. Just sort of disagree with this idea that critical minerals are the new oil. And when you think about the financial cost and just the volume of extraction, oil and critical minerals look quite different. When you're thinking about the GHG emissions and the environmental impacts of mining, no doubt there are numerous social and environmental impacts of mining. There are also numerous social and environmental impacts of continuing to rely on internal combustion vehicles and a fossil fuel powered economy. And unfortunately, just the reality of the green energy transition is that in the short term, we will need more mining. And we need to kind of think of the net positive impacts here. But I do think that doesn't mean we should just mine as much as we can, mine everywhere and mine recklessly. I mean, it still needs to be done using best practice standards. And also we need to be implementing all of these other solutions that reduce demand at the same time. I mean, there are things we can do to immediately reduce critical mineral demand in terms of shifts in our mobility rate, shifts in our vehicle size. I mean, there's no real reason to be extracting minerals to build bigger and bigger and bigger EVs. So I think all the other solutions that reduce demand need to be implemented simultaneously to reduce the amount that we are mining before we get to the point where recycling, we have enough feedstock where recycling can create this kind of perpetual loop.
Thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, it becomes, do we build a sufficient stockpile then to be able to operate in a circular kind of manner? Is where we're trying to get to. And I would think in a sustainability context, we'd have to think about, we're not getting into the details of mining regulation. One would need to be very locationally specific about where extraction is happening, for example, and analyzing what trade-offs might be happening at a particular location. So we're, hang on, I'm just going to go back into, we had one couple here. One from Michael here. Asking a more technical question, asking to improve recycling recovery, how useful would it be to advocate for a one cell form factor over another, cylindrical versus prismatic, for instance? So I think it's sort of, again, coming back to questions of battery design, and can we be doing things to sort of optimize there?
Certainly, but let's go back a little bit. When we focus on battery design, we have to think about three things. One is the performance of the battery. So that's where all the energy density improvements, the charging and discharging characteristics, and the life of the durability of the battery comes into account. The second is the safety. So you want to make sure that you have adequate sealing so that you don't have you don't have water or intrusion, and as a result, can cause faults in the battery that can lead to battery fires or any other failure mechanisms. And the third one is design for recycling, right? Where we want it to be easily disassemblable and efficient for the recycling process. What we learned in the process of engagement for the World Economic Forum and while working with the World Economic Forum and the GBA report, we talked to individuals across various parts of the supply chain, and they commented on this aspect, yes, it will always end up being a trade-off between these three characteristics. You are either trading some range or energy density improvements for making it more easier to disassemble and recycle. And certain form factors can easily help. I would point at two more data sets on developments in the industry or reports, which can help. It's a very nuanced space, the design for circularity aspects. We know what we need for recycling. We also have to understand how it affects performance and safety. There was a paper, I was trying to find that. There was a paper from Green Chemistry, if I'm not wrong. Yep. Talking about the importance of design in lithium and battery recycling. And they basically talk about how the number of cells in a battery pack influences recycling, and the form factors of those cells, how it helps or hinders recycling. They also touched upon a new technology, battery design, the blade cell technology that is being developed by CATL and BYD. And one of the reasons driving that design change was the design for circularity or for effective recycling. So how easily can you take apart the cells? You may not get to I'm not sure if the blade cell technology gets to the part where you can keep the cathode intact, but it certainly reduces the amount of material that can go into the recycling stream, and the lesser impurities you have to separate in the recovery process, it can help. And the bleed cell technology was developed to address that. So all of that to say that design for recycling is starting to generate some traction, and we will continue, and it is going to be a fast evolving space for sure.
No, this has been very interesting. Our colleague Lucas Swan, who we had through the NSERC Energy Storage Network, and he actually autopsies dead EV batteries. And his comment was, though, that it used to be you unbolted them, and now it's diamond saws and sledgehammers to get into them to be able to see what's gone wrong. So it kind of pushing that the designs have gone the other way in terms of being able to precisely do this kind of recovery or repair. Headley has been waiting patiently, so I'm going to go there, and then I think I've got one more question from Anna in the chat, and then the clock is beginning to become our enemy, I think, at that stage.
Thank you, Mark. This is a question for Sudeshna and Laura. I recently read an article that suggested that countries are considering export bans on black mass to prevent the loss of critical minerals that can offset imports from geopolitical adversaries. I wanted to know if this is a trend you're seeing, if you can verify this, and also what does the future hold for inter-country black mass trade?
Yeah, maybe I'll start off, and then certainly welcome Sud to weigh in here. I admit that I have not seen reports of bans on black mass. We have seen bans on rare earths exports and other specific minerals. There's sort of an escalating trade war right now around rare earths. I've not seen the black mass export. That is surprising to me because so much of refining and so much of processing is concentrated in China right now, that if you're not exporting black mass, I'm not really sure how other countries would be doing the processing needed to recover the minerals from that, because that part of the supply chain is just so geographically concentrated right now. So it seems surprising to me. At the same time, I'll say on kind of the general concept, I think there is some maybe some developing ideas that instead of that if we can keep critical minerals in the country once we have them, that can kind of help supply raw material to a country who doesn't otherwise have raw mineral extraction. So for example, in the US, right, we don't have a lot of critical mineral deposits. We have some lithium, but for other critical minerals, we need to either import them or we can recycle our batteries within the country once we have EV batteries within our borders. So, I mean, I think there is an idea there that perhaps it's better to sort of keep these minerals within domestic borders once you have them, because they're a precious resource. But that also isn't the reality of our supply chain right now, which is very dispersed around the world, and individual parts of the supply chain are so geographically concentrated that it's hard for me to see how like what countries are going to do with black mass if they don't export it. Let me pause there and see if Sud wants to weigh in here.
Yeah, I will just add on to a little bit of what Laura said. So, similar to her, I haven't heard of bans on export of black mass. I can certainly understand the intention there, but just holding on to black mass is not going to be the solution, because what you need after you get to the black mass stage of recycling is you need recycling facilities who can recover the minerals. And you also need facilities along the midstream who can use those recovered minerals. So unless you have cathode manufacturing or battery components manufacturing that can take back the recovered materials, manufacture battery components from them, and assemble it into battery cells and modules and pack, you need the midstream portion of the value chain to be co-located with the recycling process or the metallurgical part of the recycling process in order to be able to use all of those minerals. So the nuance here would be, if you have black mass, then you also need to make investments into all these parts of the supply chain to be able to generate your own domestic circular economy. And yeah, just holding on to black mass is not going to solve a critical mineral availability solution problem in a given region.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, that's, I mean, we should explain for the audience, the black mass is basically when you grind up the end of life batteries. It's what you're left with. It's the sort of mixture of everything the battery that was made of, for which you would then extract the materials that you would find of interest. I do think the theme of retaining the material stockpile probably is one of the underlying themes in the EU directive as well, because it's putting a very strong emphasis on, I think that's part of what underlies where they were going in terms of trying to encourage recycling and remanufacturing in the European Union. The time is nearly up on us, and so the last question I did have was from Anna, which is for those who are responding to pressures to mine everywhere in the name of critical minerals, what advice can we give? That it seems each province is pursuing its own plans with respect to efficiency or coordination across the country or potentially across North America. And certainly we're seeing a lot of, certainly in Canada, we get a lot of pressure around anything that's related to critical minerals. And I don't know if there are any thoughts on how to deal with this or respond to this.
In terms of sort of the coordination piece, I'm not sure I have any advice here in terms of how to kind of pursue mining plans in coordination. Just in general, in terms of the response to pressure to mine now everywhere. I mean, I'll maybe revisit something I said earlier, which is that, we need mining in the short term to get the minerals we need for the clean energy transition. And we need to be doing everything we can to minimize the amount of minerals that we need. And we shouldn't see the clean energy transition as an excuse to mine everywhere or to mine recklessly. Following best practice standards, respecting free prior informed consent. These are critical parts of the process, and they can't be overlooked just in the name of clean energy. We don't want to try to solve one crisis by creating another. So when it comes to mining, I mean, we absolutely must be as responsible as we can be in our processes and not try to not sort of see the urgency of climate change as an excuse to overlook these necessary precautions and best practice standards. Mark, I don't know if you have anything you want to add in terms of sort of the Canadian context here.
Well, I think that's actually a good note to end on. That certainly these questions are very front and center. We're seeing very aggressive pressures from the mining industry, supported by governments around expansion of mining activity, justified on the basis of energy transitions. And we are also seeing in a Canadian context, very clear tensions, especially around the questions of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and UNDRIP and prior informed consent. In a Canadian context, duty to consult, and also traditional Aboriginal Indigenous rights in terms of land as well, to say nothing of unresolved land claims. So this is something that cannot be a free for all. And I could not but reinforce the question that we can't be trading off one global environmental problem for another in terms of how we deal with the climate challenge. We have to be very conscious of the risks of carbon tunnel vision around this and be conscious about the trade-offs we may be making. That said, I think our time is up. And I just want to thank Laura and Sudeshna for such a wonderful contribution to those conversations. I mean, this has been incredibly informative. We have been recording, and we will post this on the SEI website as soon as the folks at EUC process this and get it ready for posting. But again, I just want to thank Laura and Sudeshna for their participation and their contributions here today. This has been extraordinarily informative and really advances the depth and quality of these conversations in a Canadian context, but I think globally as well. So thank you very, very much for your work.
Thank you for having us, and thanks so much, everyone, for joining.
Great, and thank you. I think we're scheduled for SEI. We're scheduled to do a session on hydrogen March 26th. There will be some announcements about that. And we're just discussing for April, we may bring some folks in from Australia, where there have been some very interesting conversations about nuclear power and a very interesting Canadian and Ontario connection that we may want to draw out as well. But thank you, everybody, and we will be in touch. Thank you.